So it's great to be with you and to talk about these wonderful chapters of this book. And there are a number of ways to think about these chapters, and I've just proposed one slice, which is to think about the many contrasts or comparisons in various ways, and also various conflicting views. And we begin this section with this comic interlude about Adelaide and her two suitors, Gerald Maule and Tom Spooner, Squire Spooner, and the two different views of Spooner's proposal, whether it's a matter of right or a matter of persecution, and also two views of Adelaide, Ariadne or Diana. We have Phineas and his two suitors, if you will, Lady Laura and Madame Max. This rather comic chapter, who loves him more, and when Laura says she hates Madame Max, and who will he marry, and who's better able to help him, acting womanfully as Madame Max does, or womanly as Laura does in her weeping. And then we have at least three different views of how best to aid Phineas. Mr. Lowe and Phineas's attorneys versus Madame Goesler's view. We have her view versus Lady Glen's view, which is bribery. And then we have Phineas's view of what he really wants, which is the verdict of the public, and Chaffanbrass's view, which you want the verdict of acquittal, okay? And then, of course, you have the two different possible murders, even though we know that Phineas didn't commit the murder. Not everyone knows that. And so we have the two gray coats, so much so that Lord Fawn comes to believe he's the great martyr of this trial. We have the two bludgeons, and we have two or more views about Phineas's innocence or guilt. Who are his true friends? Who really believes in him? Who doubts? There's also this notable tension between Plantagenet and Lady Glen, where she concludes by telling him, you think in decimals, I think in units, when he keeps telling her, quit thinking about this so much, stop talking about it, don't get so impassionate. And there's different views among his colleagues in the government about his guilt. And then we have the drama of the two different trips to Prague for different evidence about Reverend Emilius, Madame Goesler's successful search for the key mold, and Attorney Camperdown's successful search for proof of bigamy by Reverend Emilius. And we have two or more views about how best to be a duke and serve one's country. We have the model set by the Duke of Omnium Senior, or the current Duke of Omnium, and we have a model of the Duke of Omnium and the Duke of St. Bungay. And if that weren't enough, we also have different views of being a man and manliness. Phineas's manly beauty and his grace moved not only Lady Laura and all observers of the trial, but Chaffanbrass himself. And yet his composure in the dock he's very composed during the trial, but he comes to feel broken with this added delay due to the discovery of the evidence. So I'm just going to now try to elaborate all these a little bit and get as far as I can without going too long. Okay, so we begin with the comic interlude. And, in Can You Forgive Her, we have the comic interlude of Mr. Cheesacre and the scampish ne'er-do-well who are both in competition for Mrs. Lady Greenell, the Widow Greenell. So here we have Adelaide's love troubles. Mr. Spooner decides to seize the chance to propose again, since he's learned there's trouble with her and Gerald Maule. He and his cousin drive over there. And Adelaide does not welcome this proposal. And she says a lady has a right to know her own mind. She has a right not to be persecuted. Whereas he said, I believe I'm in a condition to offer my hand and fortune to any young lady without impropriety. And Trollope has all his classical illusions going. He feels he's come upon Ariadne unprotected, but she's more like Diana the Huntress. He's like poor Orion, who she accidentally kills in the hunt. And the narrator injects that the task of declaring love to a stony-hearted, obdurate, ill-conditioned Diana is very disagreeable for any gentleman, and it's more so when the gentleman really loves or thinks he loves his Diana. So finally, Adelaide gives up and is just completely rude to him and says, you should have looked to marry someone before I was born, which is extremely galling to him because he doesn't think he's that old. And then she basically says, you don't know anything about people if you think any girl could look at you after being loved by Mr. Mall, right? So that's the sad end of his proposal. And there's a kind of touching scene where he takes it out on his poor cousin. And his cousin likes, look, I'll put up with a lot from you, but don't push it too far. And then he gets back into better spirits. But we have an interesting glimpse of the kind of bachelor household of Ned and his cousin, and how Ned basically manages things so Mr. Spooner can focus on the hunt and other things. And we also learn Ned's backstory, that Ned was in love, but he had no money. And because he and his beloved had no money, they couldn't marry. And so Mr. Spooner feels, look, I've got plenty of money. I should be able to marry. And as he says, I have a right to propose. Okay. So then we go into competing views about how to help Phineas. Madame Max, this is a still from the Palliser series, where she says, why don't we send around the world to get evidence against that other man? So Madame Max's strategy is find evidence about the Reverend Emilius to tend to show that he's committed the murder. But Mr. Lowe is skeptical that sending money or searching around the world would really yield anything. So they've got that conversation going on. But Lady Glen has all sorts of ideas for how to help Phineas, including buying a horse and carriage for all the wives of the jurors, to spirit Lord Fawn away to the Antibes, to wear everyone out with lawyers, get all the lawyers new wigs and ruffs, and have them get into a rage. And she has her own plan for how they should exonerate Phineas. And throughout, Lady Glen keeps saying she'll go into mourning if he's found guilty. And finally, Madame Max says, I should really mourn, because Madame Max genuinely and deeply loved Phineas, and this is a life and death situation for her, trying to find out a way to help him. So, we have the attorneys kind of poo-pooing her efforts and talking about justice, and whereas Madame Max and Lady Glencora are interested in success. And then we have Phineas in prison, and the different ways in which Lady Laura and Madame Goesler take action. This is a still from the Gutenberg project illustration. You can see a woman kind of in the corner. That's Lady Laura waiting to be shown in to see Phineas. So when Lady Laura is left alone with Phineas, the object of her idolatry, she gets extremely dramatic and says, oh God, if they should murder him, and throws herself into his arms and covers him with kisses. But she's not allowed to take any active part in court as one of the character witness or any other effort on his behalf. You may recall in the last section of chapter, she wanted her money to be used to help mount his defense, but Lord Chiltern assured her that there would be ample money to provide for Phineas. So the narrator in a later chapter, she reflects and she says, woman-like, she had gone to him in her trouble, had burst through his prison doors, had thrown herself on his breast and wept at his feet. So her action is basically to insist on being shown to him and to weep and to exclaim how this is terrible. And of course, she loves him, and so forth and so on. Okay. Meanwhile, and here's another picture. Now, notably in the book, Lady Laura, when she looks in the mirror, is supposed to realize her beauty's gone. She's an old woman. She can't hope to attract Phineas. Look at her, Anne Massey. I mean, not credible. But anyway, so here we have her in visiting him in jail here. Okay. So by contrast, Madame Goesler womanfully deals out sovereigns to Mrs. Meagher, and the more sovereigns she puts on the table, the more she learns about the doings of Reverend Emilius, including the story of the coats, the story of him taking the key with him when he went to Prague so that he could actually have a key made. And so here she is in a scene from the show sitting with Mrs. Meagher. And but Mr. Wickerby, the attorney, evidently didn't think much of the unprofessional assistance which the lady proposed to give him and calls it far-fetched. Undeterred, though, she travels to Prague with her entourage to prove the secret key was made. And when Glencora says it's because she loves him, Madame Max demurs that it's womanly enthusiasm for a cause that one has taken up. So by contrast to Laura, who's very confined and limited in what she's allowed to do, Madame Max robustly takes action, even when the male authority figures tell her they don't have much confidence in what she's doing. And because the last time's presentation had so many glorious maps, I asked a research assistant for a map of Prague. So this is a 1869 map of Prague. So she goes to Prague and succeeds. Okay. So then there's two or more views about Phineas's innocence or guilt, right? Phineas remembers some training from his school days, some maxim, and says, no one at an instant of a sudden becomes most base. And even though he brandished the bludgeon, even though he made a joke threat with it, nothing should lead his true friends to doubt his innocence. So this becomes kind of a litmus test for him. And there's different views among his colleagues and in the government about whether he did it or not. Lizzie Eustace, who gets a chapter in this section, her official view, which she shares with the widow Bonteen, is of course Phineas did it, but her private view is probably Emilius did it. And if anything, it makes her esteem for Emilius rise to think he was capable of such a bold evil deed versus the kind of grasping venial sins as her husband. And Phineas versus Chaffanbrass, on one of the really interesting chapters in this series of chapters, Phineas wants the verdict of the public. He, in his very melodramatic language, he would rather be hanged today and people learn of his innocence tomorrow than be acquitted and people doubt. And, you know, this is not the world in which Chaffanbrass dwells. And he talks about proving the truth of the evidence, and he talks about the importance of a verdict of acquittal. But after he leaves visiting with Phineas, he has been so moved by Phineas that he tells someone that he rarely feels this way, but he feels he's ready to give the blood of his veins to save Phineas. And he's never felt this so strongly as he feels in Phineas's case. Okay, so there's also this tension in the household level between the Duke and Duchess of Omnium, where the Duke basically thinks Phineas did it. And the Duchess adamantly does not. And the Duke wants her to drop the subject and stop speaking of it. And there's this very interesting sentence that I'm sure we'll talk about where she says, you might as well have me ask you to stop working on the decimal points or talking to me about the decimal coinage. And she says, we must go after our nature, Plantagenet. Your nature is decimals. I run after units. So she's kind of concerned about the human situation, right? And saving Phineas. Okay, so then there's different views of being a man and of manliness, right? And I took something from a later chapter just to reflect back on how people felt about his conduct during the first part of the trial. And in chapter 67, it says, during the first long week of his trial, his uprightness, his manly beauty of his countenance, and the general courage and tranquility of his deportment had been conspicuous. So the very way he carries himself, the fact that he would stand all day in the dock and face everybody, goes to his manliness, as it will, who he is as a man. At the beginning of these chapters, Lowe says to Phineas, the time has come to show yourself to be a man. He says, yes, a man that can be hanged, right? Because he's very worried that on the bumbling evidence of Lord Fawn, he's probably going to be found guilty. And so Lowe is telling him, be a man. And Chiltern from time to time urges him to be a man. And we'll read more about that in the next set of chapters. So when Lady Chiltern testifies about Phineas, she says she regards him as someone who is brave and tenderhearted, soft in feeling, and manly in disposition. So we get this kind of androgynous picture of Phineas because we tend to think of softness as feminine, tenderheartedness as feminine, bravery as masculine in terms of traditional gender categories. So Phineas has this blend of traits, right? And we know he's good looking because Lady Laura, when she's reflecting on the fact that she's never going to get him back, she thinks of Phineas as glorious with manly beauty compared to what she sees when she looks in the mirror. And Chaffanbrass, an ugly, dirty old man by his own self, by Trollope's description, who thought himself indifferent to appearances, found himself struck, oh, sorry for the typo, by the beauty and grace of the man whom he now saw for the first time, and by his eloquence. Okay, so then we have the two views of the new evidence, the telegram that they have found, the blacksmith who made the keypad or whatever it is, the mold, so that Emilius could make another key. And then we have a big technique in Trollope is sort of how everybody knows, and often they're wrong about what they know, but they say it was of course known to everybody that Madame Goesler had undertaken a journey to Bohemia, and as many suppose a roving tour through all the wilder parts of unknown Europe, Poland, Hungary, the Principalities, with the object of looking for evidence to save the life of Phineas Finn, and grandly romantic tales were told of her wit, her wealth, her beauty, and the whole story about the Duke and his will. And of course, Madame Goesler became very popular, and they also tell us they're waiting to have a public reception for the blacksmith who's coming to talk about the mold. So with this new evidence, this telegram, the tide of public opinion is turning for Phineas. And the narrator says it may be a question whether he would not have been the most popular man in the house could he have sat there the day after the telegrams had arrived. But the Attorney General says nothing's changed about the evidence against Phineas. This latchkey doesn't really change anything. But the jurors quite indignantly disagree, and they're quite agitated that it's proposed that there be a week-long recess till they have the full proof of this evidence. They're willing to believe the telegram and go home right now, but they're reprimanded by the judge and placated by being promised that this is an important part of being a juror and so forth and so on. So even with this evidence, it's not clear to the Attorney General initially that it's really going to change matters. But of course, we know that this is very important. And so then we have this remarkable chapter, I Hate Her, with Who Loves Him More? I don't know if any of you know this old corny musical called The Pajama Game. It's about labor management relations and an efficiency expert sent to kind of scope out what to do to improve things at the factory. And the love interest, Babe, is kind of the head of the workers, and the efficiency expert is this guy, and they fall in love, and they have this crazy song where they each compete to say, I love you more, and they compare themselves with classical allusions like, Cleopatra drinking poison, or someone starting the Trojan War, and so forth and so on. So Lady Laura has this sort of over-the-top allusion to Hamlet's speech about his greater grief over Ophelia, and how could Laertes possibly mourn Ophelia as much as I do? And I have a crocodile here because Lady Laura, imitating Hamlet's speech, says, would she not have swallowed a crocodile against any she Laertes that would have thought to rival and parallel her great love? So because by now Madame Max is a hero, she's a heroine, and everyone knows that this is helping Phineas, and Laura has not been allowed to do much of anything. And she says, why hadn't been her lot to go to Prague, right? Like, why couldn't I have been one to go to Prague? Because the Laura we met in the beginning of Phineas Finn was quite capable and quite agentic, and he moved like a man, sat with her knee across her leg and leaned over, and she was hardly the confined sort of person that we now encounter. And then this is yet another occasion for Lady Laura to review her life, her great sin in refusing Phineas when she was a poor woman and giving her hand to a rich suitor, and the whole shipwreck she's made of her life. And at the end of this self-assessment, she finally sees that Phineas is never going to propose again. And he's never going to stand with her at the fall of winter. And with the last set of chapters, the final chapter had her wondering, now that she's a widow, if it could come to pass that this could happen. That now that she had the resources and she has Lothlinder, Phineas could marry her, and she could once, everything could be made right. But she now comes to see that this is not going to happen. And that's all the more reason she's in such pain, because she's probably thinking that Madame Max is going to be the one that Phineas will marry if he marries anyone. And during these chapters, Lady Glenn's a bit of a tease because she keeps talking about Lady Laura, and Madame Max at first believes that Phineas is going to marry Lady Laura, although Glencora doubts it. And when Lady Laura reports that, when Lady Glenn reports that Lady Laura has been to see Phineas in prison and is frantic about him, Madame Max says, women do not get frantic about men in these days, but actually Lady Laura really does. So she seems to contradict that. And then we get Phineas's assessment of the different women in his life. At one point, we get one of the rare references to his deceased first wife. And he says, what would his pretty young wife, who slept on his bosom and so forth and so on, think if she could look down from on high and see him wrongly accused? How would she feel? And then when Violet, another one of his loves, gives her character a testimony, Phineas is very touched, but he also knows that he had never really touched her heart, that she always loved children, and she simply was afraid it was too dangerous to marry children because of the kind of character children was before he sort of found his place in life. And he also has sort of been realizing throughout this volume that he and Lady Laura can never be more than friends. And when she comes to the prison, he initially says nothing could be happier than to see you. Then he realizes he probably shouldn't have said that because it might give her the wrong idea. And what about Madame Max? After Mr. Lowe remarks it was that the journey to Prague was a wonderful thing for her to do, Phineas thinks to himself, yes, indeed. And he starts to think about everything that's passed between them. And I interpret this final sentence as saying, I could marry her if I weren't utterly crushed by what's happened to me. Because he says, were his back not broken, and he was prostrate and must remain so, it might have been possible that she should do more for him than she had yet done. So the seed is planted that maybe it might be possible for them to be married to each other. Okay. And finally, and this is my last interlude, there's 2 or 3 ways to be a duke and serve the nation. And this comes up in the chapter, The Two Dukes, where Plantagenet proposes that to Gresham that maybe he should fill Bonteens' seat at the Board of Trade, which would be normally a step down and not really proper, but it's one of the few offices he can hold while he's the Duke. And the Duke of St. Bungay is very dismayed by this, as is public opinion generally, and gives a speech about England depends on the maintenance of a high-minded, proud, self-denying nobility, and that much of the welfare of the country depends on the manner in which you bear yourself as the Duke of Omnium. And he talks about Plantagenet's uncle, the former Duke, and how he understood his position. He had a retinue almost royal, he had incredible expenditures, and by doing all that, he maintained his position and earned the respect of everyone around him. It's a little similar to what Madame Max says about the Duke after he dies, like in the first volume, right? When Phineas questions what kind of value the life of the Duke had. And Plantagenet said, my uncle's life to me was always a problem which I could not understand. And then he says, hey, look, your life has not been as his was, and you've won a higher respect by being in office and serving the country. But nonetheless, Phineas says, I have but one ambition, to be the serviceable slave of my country. And the context of this is when he warns about the risk of tyranny, when you think, you're entitled to rule and so forth and so on. So it's a very striking exchange. And the Duke is also upset that that Plantagenet gave that didn't get a garter when he could have, right? That the garter went to someone else, and the garter should have gone to him. Okay, so I have about a minute left of my 25 minutes. So some possible discussion questions. What do you think of the different contrasts and comparisons that Trollope sets up in these chapters? I've identified some. Obviously, there's more you could set up. You could talk about different lawyering styles at the trial. You could talk about other things. And what threads in these chapters engaged you the most? Do you think Trollope successfully weaves them together? And finally, a question I always want to talk about, but you don't have to. Is Lady Laura's tragic trajectory believable or inevitable? We don't have to talk about that yet again, but this is really some of the most dramatic speeches and monologues by Lady Laura about her fate. So again, those are my proposed questions for our breakout room. And with that, I will stop.